Okay, so let's reflect back on Chapter 18, the colonial encounters in Asia and Africa. Who makes history? Winners don't make history, at least not alone. Dominant groups are limited by the presence of subordinated peoples. And a recent trend in historical study examines how subordinated peoples, even when oppressed, have been able to work for their own interests. And so those who argue that winners make history might point to the colonizers who conquered and tried to rebuild colonial societies according to their vision. Yet the colonialized people interacted with what the colonizers or brought and often made it their own, as seen in the Africanization of Christianity. And so this history from below, when you examine colonial history from the perspective of the colonized, in addition to the colonizer, we can get a fuller and more complete understanding and perspective of the colonial encounter. Okay, so let's talk about visual source 1, Prelude to the Scramble. Okay, so what images of Africa are suggested by this board game? Notice carefully the landscapes, animals, activities in which people are engaged. Well, the board game offers an image of Africa as exotic, right? Full of wild animals and tropical plants that are not usually seen in Europe. And as a land of beautiful scenery. And it suggests that Africa is a land of many different ethnic groups and only partially settled. And it also suggests that Africa has economic potential, as indicated by the plantation in the lower left section of the board. How does the game depict European activities in Africa? Well, Europeans are depicted on ships off the coast of both East and West Africa. And they're seen trading with Africans in the lower left portion of the board. And in the upper right portion, Europeans are actually firing upon Africans. Right? I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to highlight. There we go. So what 19th century realities are missing from this portrayal of Africa? Substantial cities and states of Africa, the presence of Islam in many regions, even the competition between European nations for influence in Africa and the slave trade. You don't see that here. Alright, conquest and competition. So how does this artist portray Marchand? How might a British artist have portrayed him? He was portrayed in a heroic light, right, as an intrepid explorer and a leader. A British artist might have portrayed him as an ambitious usurper, seeking to challenge British claims to territory in Africa, right, as seen by an armed invader of British territories even, and the man that the British intimidated into acknowledging British claims along the Nile, or perhaps as an intrepid explorer whose successes led to him wandering beyond French territory. There's a wide array of possibilities here. And what does this image suggest about the role of violence in the scramble for Africa? Well, the picture depicts heavily armed men on the expedition actively using their weapons. One of the men has died, even. And this implies that Marchand had to use considerable violence to stake claims to territory for the French. And notice the large number of African troops among Marchand's forces. What does that suggest about the process of colonial conquest? And why might Africans have agreed to fight on behalf of a European colonial power? We talked about this in class. A large number of African troops suggest that colonial conquest was accomplished in part by using the resources of the empire and by the participation of Africans. And Africans might have fought on behalf of a European colonial power for personal gain, right, in alliance with Europeans against other African enemies. And also because the Europeans forced them to fight on their behalf. That's entirely possible. Or out of loyalty to an already existing European empire. Okay, oh, I love this one. From the Cape to Cairo. This is such an awesome image. You can see from Cape, right, Cape Town, South Africa, to Cairo in Egypt. This is all Africa. It's not just really an island, it's an entire continent. Now this is actually a rather famous image. And look at this. Is it criticizing or celebrating Rhodes's Cape to Cairo dream? And it'd be a good idea to explain your answer, to think about why this is criticizing or why it's celebrating his dream. We can make a case that it is celebrating Rhodes as his larger-than-life figure. It could be interpreted as confident, showing the way to British success. You know, as portraying him as an intrepid adventurer with a rifle. You know, portraying him as a colossus, the original being one of the ancient wonders of the world, right? The Rhodes Colossus. And also as portraying him as a visionary, represented by the telegraph line that he's holding. But you could also argue that the image criticizes Rhodes, depicting his larger-than-life figure with his head literally in the clouds, right, symbolizing the impossibility of his vision. And Africa below his feet shows a huge distance between Cairo and Cape. So if the artist had intended it to look less daunting, he could have outlined current British imperial holdings between the 2 points. Nonetheless, the image describes Rhodes as a colossus, comparing him to the original Colossus of Rhodes, which actually toppled over in antiquity. So, it's a great image that really could represent many different things here. Now, scholars have sometimes argued that the scramble for Africa was driven less by concrete economic interests rather than by emotional, even romantic notions of national grandeur and personal adventure. And so what ways does this visual source support or challenge that interpretation? Well, in support of this interpretation, and not just this image, but this one as well, both depict a heroic figure portrayed as larger than life, a style likely to stir emotions. And the flag from this source here in the background depicts his efforts in terms of national interests. And the image also offers an indication of the economic advantage accrued from his expedition. But to challenge this interpretation, you can point out that this visual source, from Cape to Cairo, national grandeur is not explicitly evoked. There's no indication of British anything here. And also the telegraph wire might be a symbolization for the concrete economic advantages to the undertaking. Okay, here we have the British and French in North Africa. See Morocco over here and Egypt over here. A lot going on in this image, and it's rather intense. If you really think about it, what references to these incidents can you find? Let's start in terms of the dictionary. Well, the pigeons, or maybe even doves, flying near the image, or village, right? Man hanging from the gallows, a British soldier with a whip in his hand, right, that signified floggings. Of course, the village labeled Denshway in the background. What about in terms of Casablanca? Well, the skeletons that the French and British soldiers stand upon. The dead man in traditional Arab dress lying upon skeletons represents the loss of life in skirmishes, even the bombardment of the Arab quarter. In Casablanca, labeled on fire in the background, reflects the French bombardment of the Arab quarter of the town. The British and French generally saw themselves as rivals in the scramble for Africa. So how are they portrayed here? Because here, it looks like they're portrayed as allies, right? Toasting their respective repressive acts. And from a North African perspective, this makes complete sense, right? As Europeans across the region were seizing political control using similar means. So it almost looks like they're working together, even though the British and the French were rivals and competing for land in Africa. That's a great image to, see it from a completely different perspective. And of course, there are obviously some criticisms of colonial rule in this image, right? It's clearly critical of colonial rule. It highlights the brutal acts undertaken by those Western powers, right? The shelling of Casablanca, the execution and flogging of villagers in Egypt. And it highlights culturally insensitive acts undertaken by colonial powers with its reference to the desecration of a Muslim cemetery. Oh, what a great image. Alright, and our last one, the Ethiopian Exception. This is a great visual when learning about how all of the resistance movements in Africa failed except Ethiopia. Right? How does this painting represent the Ethiopian triumph at Adowa? The painting depicts the triumph of a powerful army with modern armaments, and the victory was the result of the protection of St. George. And what features of the painting might help explain that improbable victory, at least to Ethiopian observers? How does this artist portray the resources available to each side? Well, the features here that help explain the victory, include the presence of St. George, and the Ethiopian troops are in possession of modern armaments, right? And the number of troops is relatively even, right? But the Ethiopians possess more cavalry, as well as, the armed men with swords and, who appear to have successfully attacked a machine gun. That's, odd. But, and the Italians look like they possess more heavy guns and heavy weapons like cannons and machine guns. So how did the Ethiopian painter depict the Italian enemy? And keep in mind that Ethiopian artists generally portrayed the forces of good in full face, while the wicked or evil were shown in profile. Now you see it, right? Full face, profile. The Italians are depicted in profile, right? In massed ranks of cannon, machine guns, officers on horseback, even behind the massed rank of infantry. But not the Ethiopians. So, how do you imagine the news of this battle was received elsewhere in Africa? Among the peoples of African descent in the Americas even. This was probably received with pride by other Africans contending with European encroachment, may have given other African peoples hope to their resistance movements. And then the Americans, it might have even brought a sense of pride in those of African descent. So the memory of Adol likely gave Ethiopians the confidence that they could defeat Mussolini's forces later on than they did, like they did in World War II, right? And just like they had done here in 1896. Right? It gave them a useful rallying point to inspire resistance and nationalism to the Italians. And that sums up the reflections and visual sources for Chapter 18.